November 1605. The air of London hung heavy with mist, and the Thames moved like a ribbon of dark glass beneath the moon. Somewhere under the Palace of Westminster, a man waited alone in the shadows, his breath steady, his hands resting near a coiled fuse that could change the course of a kingdom. Above him, the city slept, unaware of the storm about to rise from its cellars. The bells of St. Paul's struck midnight, their echoes traveling through the fog and the narrow lanes where history itself seemed to hold its breath. It had been only 2 years since the death of Elizabeth I, and yet her absence still haunted England like an echo that refused to fade. For nearly half a century, she had ruled with unmatched will and intelligence, holding together a nation divided by faith and ambition. But her reign, though glorious in the eyes of poets, had left deep wounds beneath the surface. Religion had been the quiet war of every household, the invisible line that split families apart. Catholics whispered prayers in secret, fearing the knock at the door that might end their peace. The Queen's laws, crafted to secure her throne, had turned belief into danger. When she died in 1603, childless and weary, the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, the son of the executed Mary, Queen of Scots. To many, his coming felt like a turning of fate, a reconciliation between England and the ghosts it had created. James was learned, curious, and eager to unite the two crowns under a single rule. His mother's Catholic faith gave hope to those who had suffered under Elizabeth's strict decrees. They imagined that this new king, young and intellectual, might open the doors of tolerance that had long been sealed. As James traveled south from Edinburgh, crowds lined the roads to greet him. They cheered, waved branches, and shouted blessings. He rode not as a conqueror, but as a man stepping into destiny. Yet behind the cheers lay suspicion. England had learned to smile and doubt at the same time. The courtiers who watched him enter London whispered of his accent, his manners, his unfamiliar ways. They praised his wit, but questioned his strength. Could a Scottish king truly rule the heart of England? Could a man raised in the theology of Calvin balance the tempers of a divided realm? James tried to present himself as the king of peace. He declared an end to the long war with Spain, and his first proclamations hinted at mercy for Catholics. In smoky taverns and quiet chapels, families spoke his name with cautious hope. For the first time in decades, they dared to dream of worship without fear. The punishments that had once drained them, fines, imprisonments, public shame, might at last fade into memory. Some even sent petitions asking only to live as loyal subjects who prayed differently. But power in England was a delicate thing. The Parliament, still dominated by fierce Protestant voices, viewed Catholic mercy as weakness. Advisors warned James that Rome would never rest, that leniency would invite rebellion. His counsel pressed him to strengthen, not soften, the laws of faith. Slowly, one decision after another, the promises of tolerance withered. By 1604, the old penalties returned. Catholics were again required to take oaths renouncing the Pope. Mass was forbidden. Those who refused faced ruin. Disillusionment settled over the land like ash. Men who had once hoped for peace now spoke only in whispers of betrayal. Some withdrew into silence, building secret altars within their homes. Others turned their anger inward, calling it patience, telling themselves that suffering was a form of virtue. But a few, men of restless hearts and wounded pride, began to speak of action. They saw not rebellion, but redemption, an act that could cleanse the realm and restore the old faith in a single stroke. Meanwhile, James continued to believe himself a unifier. He wrote essays about kingship, describing rulers as the earthly image of divine order. He saw monarchy as sacred, ordained by heaven. To question the king was to question God. It was a philosophy born of fear as much as faith, for James had known danger all his life. As a child, he had watched his mother executed. He had been surrounded by treachery, forced to wear a crown before he understood its weight. Those memories never left him. They shaped a king who craved control, who mistrusted passion and dissent. At his court, religion became a matter of politics more than belief. He allowed debate, but punished defiance. When he looked upon his parliament, he saw not partners but potential conspirators. His eyes read disloyalty in every gesture. To him, peace required obedience, and obedience demanded fear. So he tightened the reins of power, unaware that every decree he signed pushed a few more souls into desperation. England itself stood at a strange crossroads. Theaters flourished, trade grew, and exploration expanded the known world. London was a city of merchants, actors, and philosophers, alive with ambition. Yet beneath that energy lay division. In the taverns, rumors drifted like smoke, of Spanish agents, of secret priests, of plots whispered in Latin. The poor struggled under taxes and suspicion. The rich lived behind guarded gates, their loyalty proven daily by words and attendance at church. To believe differently was to live half a life, always hiding a part of oneself. In that tension, the soul of a nation twisted. Faith was no longer a private matter. It was a declaration of allegiance. The government measured loyalty by prayer. The church became the arm of the crown, and those who would not bend were marked, watched, and fined until hope drained from them. Yet hope, even when crushed, finds strange ways to survive. It turns to poetry, to silence, to rebellion. As months passed, the discontent deepened. Among the Catholic gentry, there were men who had lost everything except conviction. They met in secluded houses, spoke carefully, and dreamed recklessly. They saw themselves as soldiers of conscience rather than traitors. One of them, a man named Robert Catesby, burned with quiet intensity. His father had been punished for his faith. His estates were burdened with fines. To him, patience had become cowardice. He believed the time had come to strike, not for vengeance, but for the soul of England. But that moment lies ahead in another chapter. For now, the seed of revolt remained buried in silence. In the palace, James slept uneasily. His nightmares were filled with signs and omens. He feared not just rebellion, but the unseen, the dark corridors of belief that reason could not command. He surrounded himself with guards, with ministers who fed his anxieties. They spoke of loyalty, yet they thrived on fear. Every whisper of dissent became a threat to be crushed. Across the countryside, churches stood empty of peace. The land itself seemed to breathe uneasily. The fields were quiet, the roads filled with travelers seeking work or forgiveness. In small villages, priests moved by night, hearing confessions behind shuttered doors. Every act of devotion became an act of defiance. Still, the world continued to turn. Ships sailed from London's ports to distant oceans. Scholars debated in Oxford halls. Plays drew laughter in crowded theaters. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, a different pulse beat, one of unease and expectation. Something was approaching, though few could name it. The story that would become legend was not born from hatred alone. It was born from disappointment, from the slow erosion of trust. A king who had promised mercy became a symbol of restraint. A people who had prayed for acceptance found themselves branded as enemies. Between them lay a void that words could no longer bridge. In that void, an idea began to smolder. It whispered through taverns, through corridors, through the restless dreams of men who had waited too long. It said that faith could no longer wait for forgiveness. It said that renewal might come not through persuasion, but through fire. Above ground, the Palace of Westminster stood serene in its stone dignity, its towers reaching for heaven. Inside, officials prepared for the next session of Parliament. The king's throne gleamed, awaiting his arrival. Beneath those marble floors, the silence deepened. History often moves quietly before it roars. In the stillness before dawn, England seemed calm. But calm, in such moments, is only the surface of a tide preparing to turn. The people carried on, merchants counting coins, children running through fog, guards lighting their torches, unaware that the fuse of destiny had already been laid. The bells rang again, long and low. Their sound drifted over the city, over the river, over the sleeping minds of a nation about to wake to its own reflection. For every kingdom that forgets compassion, there comes a reckoning, not of swords, but of conscience. England, in that autumn of 1605, stood at the edge of both, and somewhere beneath its heart, a man waited still, watching the flame he had not yet struck, wondering if heaven would forgive what men had forced him to do. The silence that surrounded him was not peace, but promise, the kind of stillness that comes just before history changes its breath. Centuries later, the echoes of that night would linger, Fires would burn in celebration, children would laugh beneath fireworks, and the name of a man once condemned would become a symbol of defiance and memory. The people would light their bonfires not to destroy, but to remember. Each spark would rise into the November sky as a question, ancient yet alive. Can faith survive beneath the weight of power? And can power endure without faith? If you listen closely to the crackle of those flames, you can still hear the echo of that question, the murmur of a kingdom learning that even the smallest spark, once kindled by belief, can outlast the might of any crown. The kingdom that called itself enlightened was haunted by its own shadows. When James I ascended the throne, he inherited not only Elizabeth's crown, but also her fears. Fears carved into law, sealed in parchment, and enforced by men who believed that conscience could be measured by obedience. The realm was outwardly calm, yet beneath the sermons and decrees lay a nation that no longer trusted itself. For generations, England had been at war with its own soul. The acts of supremacy and uniformity under Elizabeth had declared the monarch supreme over faith. And from that proclamation flowed decades of quiet suffering. To attend Mass was treason. To harbor a priest was death. To speak Latin prayers was enough to invite ruin. In villages scattered across the green countryside, families built hiding places behind chimneys and under staircases, small, secret chambers known as priest holes. They were dark, narrow, and airless. Yet in them the faithful clung to the promise that belief might outlast persecution. The government's spies were everywhere. Sheriffs and constables searched homes for crucifixes, rosaries, and books printed beyond the channel. Informants were paid in silver for every secret mass they revealed. Men lost their estates. Widows lost their bread. Children grew up in silence, learning to speak loyalty by day and faith by night. To be Catholic in England was to live as a shadow among one's own people, tolerated only so long as one remained invisible. James, despite his early words of conciliation, had chosen to continue this system. The fines filled the royal treasury. The fear filled the air. In his mind, it was not cruelty, but order. A kingdom divided by religion, he reasoned, could never stand united under the crown. Yet the more he demanded conformity, the more resistance deepened. The laws, like the walls of a prison, kept peace only by containing despair. Amid that despair grew men who no longer wished to live quietly. They were born to privilege, educated in courtesy, and raised under the same sky as their persecutors. But they saw their inheritance, faith, land, and dignity stripped away by decree. Among them was one who would become the soul of a secret destined to shake a kingdom, Robert Catesby. He was not a monster of passion or a fool driven by rage. Those who knew him spoke of his charm, his intellect, his fierce devotion. He came from a noble family of Warwickshire, a line that had once served the crown faithfully. His father, a steadfast Catholic, had spent years in prison for refusing to renounce his faith. When the elder Catesby died, he left his son an estate burdened with debt and a memory burdened with resentment. Robert inherited both. In his youth, he had sought harmony. He had married, attended court, even paid the fines imposed on recusants, Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services. For a time, he had tried to live between worlds, loyal to the king, but faithful to God in secret. But England had little mercy for those who stood in the middle. The laws tightened, the taxes grew heavier, and the promise of tolerance faded into mockery. When his wife died, something in Catesby hardened. He began to see his nation not as a home, but as a test, a purgatory of injustice that could only be cleansed by sacrifice. To friends, he confided that patience had become cowardice, that faith demanded action. "We are not born to suffer endlessly," he told one companion. "We are born to restore what has been broken." It was not death he sought, but purification, a moment when fire might redeem what words had failed to heal. Those who gathered around him shared that same weariness, that same longing for redemption. There was Thomas Winter, intelligent and measured, a man of reason whose logic could not silence his conscience. There was Thomas Percy, kinsman to the powerful Northumberland family, restless and proud, angered by promises unkept. And there were the Wright brothers, Jack and Christopher, quiet men of courage whose friendship was as fierce as their faith. They met in houses tucked along the narrow lanes of London, speaking in whispers and shadows. To the world, they were gentlemen sharing supper. To one another, they were builders of a vision. They dreamed not of vengeance, but of renewal, of a world where the old faith could breathe again. Yet they also knew that words would not move the king. England had been built on decrees, not dialogues, so they began to imagine a deed so vast, so decisive, that it would tear down the foundations of fear itself. Catesby was the architect, but he needed a craftsman, someone who understood the art of fire, the alchemy of destruction. That man would come to them from the wars of Europe, bearing the scent of powder and the discipline of soldiers. His name was Guy Fawkes. He was born in York, the son of a Protestant lawyer and a Catholic mother. When his father died, the boy drifted toward his mother's faith, drawn by its rituals and endurance. He had grown to manhood in a world where belief was a battlefield, and perhaps it was inevitable that he would seek literal battle. He crossed the Channel to join the Spanish army in the Low Countries, where Catholic Spain fought Protestant rebels. There he learned the craft that would define his legend, the use of gunpowder, the careful science of controlled flame. Those who met him abroad spoke of his composure, his tall frame, his calm gaze. He was not a reckless man, nor easily swayed by words. He fought with precision, prayed with conviction, and carried himself with the quiet authority of one who had seen the cost of belief in blood and smoke. When he returned to England under an assumed name, it was not ambition that brought him, but loyalty to an idea that faith could not be silenced forever. Catesby heard of him through Thomas Wintour, who had traveled to the continent seeking allies. Wintour met Fawkes in Flanders, impressed by his courage and skill. In a dimly lit room above a tavern, he told him of England's plight, of a people trapped between obedience and conscience. Fawkes listened, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped as though in prayer. When Winter finished, the soldier spoke only one sentence: "If it is for faith and not for pride, then I will stand with you." That sentence sealed his fate. When Wintour returned to London with Fawkes at his side, the small circle gathered in secret to meet him. The room was lit by a single candle, its flame flickering across the faces of men who would soon wager their souls. Catesby regarded the newcomer with curiosity. Here was not a nobleman or courtier, but a soldier, a man shaped by battle and silence. Fawkes bowed slightly. "I am called Guido among the Spaniards," he said, "but in England I am simply a servant of the cause." Catesby smiled faintly. "Then you are welcome, Master Fawkes. We do not seek servants, only brothers." Their hands met, not in friendship, but in covenant. For in that moment they believed themselves chosen. They would not live as shadows. They would become the fire that revealed the truth. What they planned was not rebellion in their eyes, but salvation. They told themselves that the sin was not in the act, but in the inaction that allowed evil to reign. "We do not conspire to destroy," Catesby said softly, "but to cleanse." The plan was still only a whisper, an outline without detail, but the conviction was already complete. They would strike at the seat of power itself, at the moment when all who upheld their oppression, king, lords, and bishops, would gather in one place. They would light a flame beneath the very throne that had smothered them, and from that flame, they believed, England would rise renewed. In the months that followed, they moved carefully. They sought allies who could be trusted, men whose faith outweighed their fear. Yet trust, even among the faithful, was fragile. Every invitation risked discovery. Every confession risked betrayal. They spoke in parables and code, as though even their words might betray them to the wind. But secrecy, like fire, consumes those who tend it too long. The more they hid, the deeper their conviction burned. Catesby's house at Ashby St. Ledgers became their meeting place, its quiet halls echoing with prayers and plans. Maps of Westminster were spread across tables. Letters written in invisible ink passed between counties. Powder was purchased under false names. And through it all, Fawkes remained the calm center, the man who understood what they intended to do and how it could be done. He inspected barrels, measured quantities, calculated distances. To the others, the mathematics of destruction seemed almost sacred in his hands. He spoke little, worked steadily, and prayed often. Those who doubted the righteousness of their path found comfort in his certainty. They saw in him a soldier's discipline wedded to a saint's devotion. But beneath their faith lay something they could not name, the quiet terror of destiny. Each knew that what they planned might fail, and failure meant more than death. It meant disgrace, not just for them, but for the cause they claimed to serve. Yet they could not turn back. Catesby's voice, persuasive and unyielding, reminded them that the crown had left them no choice. "Mercy has been denied us," he said one night. "We have been fined, imprisoned, silenced. If the king will not hear our prayers, he shall hear our thunder." Outside, rain lashed the windows. The candlelight trembled on their faces. Fawkes lifted his gaze from the table. "Then let the thunder be just," he replied, "and let it fall only where injustice reigns." In that sentence, the story of England's most infamous conspiracy found its heartbeat. They believed themselves not destroyers, but instruments, the hand of judgment in a world deaf to reason. Whether heaven shared their view, none could say. But faith, once wedded to desperation, needs no permission. As autumn deepened, London sank into fog again. The Thames rolled quietly beneath the bridges, carrying with it the reflections of a city unaware of the fuse being wound in its foundations. Above ground, carriages rattled through the streets, and church bells called the faithful to prayer. Below, in taverns and cellars, plans took shape in whispers. The conspirators began to rent a small house near Parliament under the name of Thomas Percy, whose position in the Royal Guard gave them access few could question. Beneath that house, a tunnel was started, the first passage toward the dream that would one day bear a single name, the Gunpowder Plot. But for now, in that winter of 1604, it was still only an idea, fragile and luminous, flickering like the candle between them. They called themselves brothers in faith. Others would call them traitors. History, ever indifferent, would call them both. And as the night stretched long over London, Catesby looked at the men around him and thought not of crowns or politics, but of salvation. "If the world will not hear the truth," he murmured, "then the truth must roar." None of them spoke after that. Only the faint scent of powder lingered in the air, and the unspoken certainty that the path they had chosen could end only in flame. Under the cloak of night, London seemed to fold in on itself. The fog rolled in thick from the Thames, swallowing the street lamps and muffling every sound except the faint rhythm of hooves on wet cobblestones. In one unlit corner of the city, down a narrow alleyway known only to those who sought secrecy more than shelter, a door closed softly behind a group of men. Inside, a single candle burned low, its flame trembling as if aware of the oath about to be spoken. It was early spring of 1604. The air in the room was cold and still, heavy with the scent of wax and secrecy. Robert Catesby stood at the head of a table worn smooth by time. Around him sat Thomas Wintour, Thomas Percy, Jack Wright, and Christopher Wright. Their eyes held the kind of stillness that comes when men have crossed a point of no return, even if they have not yet spoken it aloud. No words of anger were exchanged, no boasts of glory. They spoke of faith, of the silence of heaven, and of the weight that had pressed on their souls for years. To them this was not treason but covenant, a vow born from despair and devotion in equal measure. On the table lay a small crucifix, a Bible, and a dagger, whose blade caught the light of the candle. They did not need to be told what these symbols meant. The crucifix for faith, the Bible for truth, the dagger for silence. Catesby's voice was low, steady, and deliberate. "By the light of this candle and before the eyes of God who sees all hearts," he began, "we swear to stand together in life and in death for the deliverance of our faith and the freedom of our souls. No man here shall betray another, nor turn his face from what must be done." Each of them repeated the words, one by one, their hands resting upon the crucifix. When it was done, there was no applause, no relief, only quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Then, from the corner of the room, the door opened and a priest entered. He was Father John Gerard, one of the many who lived as a fugitive among friends. He said nothing of what he had heard, for he had heard nothing directly. But he prepared the altar nonetheless, and the men knelt for the Mass. As the incense rose and the Latin prayers filled the air, something in the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a conspiracy, it was consecration. Religion had become gunpowder, and faith had become the fuse. When they left that room, the oath bound them tighter than any law. They were brothers now, not by blood, but by purpose. The months that followed turned their vow into structure, their vision into plan. Thomas Percy, leveraging his position as a gentleman of the King's Guard, rented a small house near the Palace of Westminster. It was the perfect disguise, the dwelling of a loyal servant within steps of Parliament itself. The landlord suspected nothing. Percy's name carried honor. The conspirators met there often, always under cover of night. They spoke in whispers, their discussions punctuated by the occasional creak of the floorboards above them. They mapped the Parliament chambers with precision, measuring distances, tracing walls, memorizing the movement of guards. The original idea was simple and impossible all at once: to dig a tunnel beneath the House of Lords, fill it with powder, and ignite it at the precise moment the king, his lords, and his ministers gathered for the opening of Parliament. The explosion, they believed, would not only end the reign of persecution, but also open a path for renewal. From the ashes of tyranny, they imagined a new England would rise, one united under faith rather than fear. It was Thomas Wintour who oversaw the details. He calculated how much powder they would need, how far the blast would reach, and how long the tunnel must be to reach the foundations of Parliament. Fawkes, the expert, confirmed the numbers. He had seen fortresses collapse in war with far less. 36 barrels would suffice. Each would be hidden in casks marked as coal or wine, smuggled into the rented cellar beneath the building when the time was right. The schedule they chose was not random. The opening of Parliament was set for November 5th, 1605, a day when the king, the princes, the bishops, and the lords of England would gather under one roof. For the conspirators, it was the perfect alignment of destiny and opportunity. "One spark," Catesby whispered, "and England will awaken." As summer turned to autumn, the fog thickened over London, wrapping its narrow streets in secrecy. The men moved through the city like ghosts, ordinary faces by day, shadows by night. They carried letters under false names, made coded exchanges in taverns, and used church confessions to pass messages that could not be written on paper. Through all of this, Fawkes became the heart of their operation. His calmness steadied the others. His precision made the impossible seem methodical. He was the one who arranged the barrels, checked the locks, and tested the fuses. He was the man who would light the flame and stay behind to ensure the plan succeeded. In their minds, he was not merely a soldier, but a guardian of their faith. To walk through London then was to move through a city built on contradiction. The same streets that echoed with sermons of loyalty also hid rooms of rebellion. In cellars beneath the cobblestones, rosaries hung beside barrels of powder, candles burned before crucifixes just a few feet from where the instruments of destruction were stored. The old churches, many stripped bare of their icons, seemed to watch silently, their stones remembering what men had forgotten. The conspirators worked with patience and devotion, yet even they could feel the weight of their undertaking. They spoke less of revenge now, and more of duty. "We do this," Catesby said, "not to destroy a nation, but to cleanse it. England must be reborn." His words carried the conviction of a man who saw himself not as an assassin, but as an instrument of divine justice. Outside, the pulse of London went on. Street vendors shouted beneath gray skies. Ships creaked along the river. The bells of St. Paul's marked the hours as they always had. The city, unaware, lived its routine. And beneath its feet, the slow architecture of rebellion grew stronger. When the first barrels arrived, it was Fawkes who received them. The deliverymen carried them in carts disguised as shipments of fuel. Each cask was heavy, its contents sealed and unmarked. He stored them carefully, one after another, beneath the Parliament building. 36 in total, enough to turn stone into dust if fate allowed. Every step of the plan was measured, rehearsed, and repeated until it became ritual. Winter checked the documents. Percy arranged the access through his position at court. Catesby coordinated the funds and kept the group united through letters written in cautious ink. At times, doubt crept in, a tremor of conscience that no prayer could silence. They wondered whether God truly sanctioned such an act, whether the heavens approved of justice that required so heavy a price. Yet each time Catesby's certainty restored them. What sin is greater, he asked, to act against injustice or to allow it to live? The answer hung in the air like incense after Mass. They told themselves that history would understand, that God would judge the purity of their intention rather than the violence of their means. It was Wintour who voiced what others feared to admit. If we fail, we will not be remembered as martyrs, but as villains. Catesby looked at him with a calm that bordered on reverence. If we succeed, he said, there will be no one left to call us villains. The words were neither cruel nor proud, only certain, the kind of certainty that comes when conviction outweighs consequence. By autumn of 1605, their preparations neared completion. The barrels rested beneath Parliament, layered with wood and coal. The fuse had been tested and timed. Fawkes had rehearsed his role again and again. He would light the slow match and escape by boat across the Thames, then flee to Flanders before dawn. From there, Catesby and the others would rise in the Midlands, rallying supporters to proclaim a new monarch sympathetic to their cause. Each detail was written in the mind rather than on paper. Secrecy was their only protection. And yet, secrecy is a fragile shield. It cracks under the weight of time and conscience. A single word spoken in the wrong ear could end everything. Still, they believed they were guided by Providence. They gathered one last time in London, in the same house where they had sworn their first oath. The candle burned as it had before. Fawkes knelt before the crucifix. Catesby stood behind him, his voice almost tender. When we began, he said, we asked for God's witness. Tonight, we ask for his forgiveness, not for what we have done, but for what we must do. They received communion in silence. Outside, the bells tolled midnight. In that moment, London seemed to hold its breath again, as it had once before. The mist crept through the alleys, softening the sound of the river. The men stepped out one by one, each heading toward his fate. Fawkes disappeared into the fog, the key to the cellar hanging from his belt. The city slept, unaware that beneath its heart, 36 barrels waited for dawn. History would later call it conspiracy, rebellion, or treason, but to those who lived it, it was something else. The desperate prayer of a generation erased from the map of faith. They were not men of hatred, but of exhaustion. They had pleaded, waited, hoped, and finally despaired. Their rebellion was the language of silence that had lasted too long. Every kingdom, at some moment, drives its believers to the edge of faith. In England, that moment came not with the sword, but with the whisper of a match about to burn. And so, as the final leaves of autumn fell into the Thames, the fuse of destiny lay coiled beneath Westminster, unseen, untouched, waiting. It was not yet November. The Parliament doors were still locked, but history, patient and unblinking, had already struck the first spark. For in that dark cellar, sealed beneath the weight of empire, the prayer of centuries had taken its most dangerous form. It no longer sought mercy or change. It sought ignition. And when faith becomes flame, no crown can rest easy above it. The throne of James I glittered in the light of reason but trembled beneath the weight of fear. He was a scholar king, fluent in theology and rhetoric, a man who believed that words could hold together a kingdom better than armies. Yet beneath his carefully polished intellect lay the unease of a man forever watching the shadows behind his crown. He had come from the north, from the rugged hills of Scotland, where kings were made by blood and unmade by treachery. His childhood had been a long apprenticeship in fear. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed. His tutors shifting from protectors to manipulators. His nobles treating loyalty as a bargain. From the moment he could walk, James understood that power was not a gift, but a balance, and that one stumble could mean ruin. Now seated on the throne of England, he was both conqueror and outsider. The people hailed him as the chosen successor of Elizabeth, yet they whispered behind closed doors about his accent, his northern manners, his uncertain claim. He saw smiles at court, but none that he trusted. Perhaps that was why he wrapped himself in the doctrine of the divine right of kings. In his mind, kingship was not a contract between ruler and ruled. It was a covenant between God and his chosen servant. The king stood above parliament, above bishops, above law itself. His power was absolute because it came from heaven, and to question him was to question the divine order of the world. James wrote of it often, filling pages with elaborate arguments to prove what his heart already needed to believe. "Kings are little gods upon earth," he declared, "sitting upon God's throne in the midst of men." But if God's authority was absolute, then any challenge to it must be the work of darkness. And thus, in James's mind, rebellion and witchcraft became siblings, different faces of the same evil. He wrote a treatise called Demonology, in which he described in chilling detail how the devil whispered into human hearts, how invisible forces turned loyalty to treason. He saw conspiracies not only in politics, but in the air itself, in storms that delayed his ships, in dreams that disturbed his sleep. "A rebel," he once told his council, "is but a witch wearing a man's shape." That belief shaped his rule more than any policy. Suspicion became the language of his court. He surrounded himself with informers and ministers who thrived on fear. The Privy Council became a theater of whispers, its members bound together not by loyalty, but by mutual distrust. Robert Cecil, the sharp-minded statesman who had served Elizabeth before him, learned to play the king's anxiety like an instrument. He warned of plots, Catholic, foreign, or imaginary, and in every warning his own power grew. James rewarded him with titles and estates, trusting him as one might trust a wall built of smoke. Under such a ruler, England's government was like a house lit by candlelight, outwardly steady, yet always one breath away from darkness. The Church of England stood firm on its throne, but the unity it claimed was fragile. Puritans demanded stricter reform. Catholics begged for mercy. Each saw the other as an enemy of truth. In Parliament, ministers debated not how to serve the people, but how to guard the throne from invisible foes. And outside the marble halls, life was harder still. The poor struggled through winters of famine and disease. Wars abroad drained treasure from the crown, while peace at home remained an illusion. In the countryside, the people worked the fields with faith in their hands, but hunger in their bellies. In the cities, apprentices and merchants prayed in half-empty churches, wondering if salvation could survive beneath the weight of politics. Everywhere, suspicion walked the streets. Soldiers searched homes for priests. Families whispered prayers behind bolted doors. A knock at midnight could mean confession or condemnation. In the ruins of old abbeys, ivy grew over broken altars, the silent memorial of a faith outlawed but unextinguished. And all the while the king spoke of unity. James believed he could reason his realm into peace. To his mind, theology was a science. If he could find the perfect argument, he could reconcile heaven and earth. He summoned theologians, debated with bishops, and wrote essays on harmony. He imagined himself not merely as monarch, but as mediator, the one man who could balance doctrine with rule. But faith is not built from logic. He could not understand why hearts did not bend to persuasion, why people clung to rituals and symbols instead of to words. To James, truth was clarity. To his subjects, it was mystery. And between those two visions, an empire cracked. The more he tried to impose unity, the more he revealed division. His proclamations pleased no one. Too gentle for zealots, too harsh for dreamers. The Puritans accused him of compromise. The Catholics accused him of betrayal. Each sermon delivered in his name seemed to wound another part of his people. To those who watched him at court, James seemed confident, even jovial, fond of conversation, of hunting, of wit. But when he retired to his chambers, he carried with him the same restless dread that had followed him from Scotland. He saw plots in laughter, treachery in silence. He slept with guards outside his door and dreamed of fires beneath his throne. In one such dream, he later confided, he saw a serpent coiled around the foundations of Parliament, its eyes burning like embers. When he woke, he ordered new patrols along the river and doubled the watch at Westminster. He could not have known how close that dream was to truth. The atmosphere of his reign was not tyranny, but unease, the slow suffocation of trust. Courtiers flattered him with poetry while spying for each other. Priests preached loyalty while fearing arrest. The entire kingdom breathed through clenched teeth, waiting for a danger it could not name. And yet, amidst all the anxiety, There was a strange stillness, the stillness that precedes a storm. London in 1605 glittered with theaters, merchants, and ships. Its surface shone with prosperity. But beneath the cobblestones, fear was fermenting. The more the king sought to control, the less he understood what he ruled. In his heart, James believed he was governing with reason. He despised bloodshed, valued learning, and saw himself as a man of moderation. But moderation, in an age of extremes, becomes its own provocation. To those who longed for freedom of worship, his tolerance was deceit. To those who demanded conformity, his patience was weakness. He stood between two worlds, the world of Elizabeth's iron order and the world of the coming revolution, and he belonged fully to neither. When he looked out from the palace windows toward Westminster, he saw not a city, but a battlefield of invisible wars. His ministers saw only opportunity, his enemies saw only tyranny. Between them, the people endured. On Sundays, the bells of London rang across the city, summoning souls to worship. But many of those who came entered churches stripped of meaning, their saints removed, their prayers rewritten. They sang hymns of loyalty to a crown that neither trusted nor loved them. Their voices echoed beneath vaulted ceilings, once filled with incense, now filled with silence. The government called this peace, but it was a peace of exhaustion, not of harmony, a peace that demanded silence, not forgiveness. And so, in the royal court, where fear disguised itself as wisdom, the king continued to write. He wrote sermons for others to preach, laws for others to enforce, and essays to explain why divine power must be absolute. The more he wrote, the more he convinced himself that he was right. But conviction, like power, is a fragile thing. It shatters under the weight of doubt. In his study, surrounded by books, James imagined himself as Solomon, a man chosen by God to judge the living and the dead. Yet Solomon's wisdom had come from humility, and that was the one virtue James could never fully master. His letters reveal flashes of humanity, moments of warmth, even humor, yet always returning to the same refrain: the king's safety is the realm's safety. To him, loyalty to the crown was not politics, but morality itself. And thus, every act of dissent became not a disagreement, but a sin. It was a dangerous philosophy because it left him blind to the humanity of his opponents. To question the king's rule was in his mind to serve the devil, and so every Catholic, every Puritan, every critic became a potential heretic in the war between God and chaos. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The people did not conspire because they hated him. They conspired because they no longer felt seen. In his effort to rule through logic, James forgot that hearts cannot be reasoned into obedience. He believed that words could govern, that law could redeem, that fear could discipline. Yet fear, once released, obeys no master. It grows, echoing through the chambers of power, until even the king who unleashed it becomes its prisoner. In those last weeks before November 1605, the unease within the palace had grown palpable. Reports of suspicious movements near Parliament were dismissed, then reconsidered, then forgotten. The courtiers whispered that the king's nightmares were returning. He spoke more frequently of fate, of divine trials, of the testing of kings. God will reveal all hidden things, he said to Cecil one night, his hands trembling slightly as he held a glass of wine. Cecil bowed and murmured assent, though his mind was already elsewhere, calculating, watching, waiting. Outside, the city slept beneath the fog. In taverns, men spoke of hunger and taxes, of war and faith. No one yet knew how close they stood to the fire. But in that uneasy calm, destiny was aligning. For the king who believed rebellion was the devil in human form was about to face the proof of his own prophecy. And when the echo of that prophecy reached the cellars of Westminster, the line between superstition and foresight would vanish. For now, though, James still ruled in the light of reason, a light growing dimmer each day. He sat upon his throne, believing he held dominion over both heaven and earth, never realizing that beneath him, in the silence of the stone foundations, another kind of faith had already begun to burn. History would later judge him kindly as a learned man and the father of a united Britain. But in those days, before the explosion, before the confession, before the legend, he was something smaller and sadder, a man of intellect surrounded by fear. a king who trusted his pen more than his people, and a ruler who believed that by mastering words, he could command the hearts of men. Yet, as every empire learns, words cannot calm the sound of thunder once it has begun to roll. And in the stillness before November's dawn, the thunder was already gathering, deep beneath his throne, waiting for the hand of fate to strike. London, October 1605. The air carried the heaviness of rain and ash, and the streets shimmered beneath lanterns that struggled against the fog. Each night seemed to last longer than the one before, as if time itself were holding its breath beneath the surface of that sleepless city. In the quiet stone belly of Westminster, a secret waited in the dark, a secret built from faith, fear, and 36 barrels of silence. In the final weeks before Parliament was set to meet, the preparations entered their most dangerous stage. The conspirators had worked in fragments for more than a year, each task isolated so that no single man could betray the whole. Now the pieces came together. Horses carried barrels through the narrow lanes by night, disguised under tarps of coal and wood. The carts rattled softly on the cobblestones, their drivers whispering to guards that they were delivering winter fuel for the palace. No one suspected that beneath the timber and straw lay the raw heart of a dream, enough gunpowder to turn a city into a story. Guy Fawkes, calm and unreadable, oversaw every delivery. He had taken on a new name, John Johnson, and posed as the servant of Thomas Percy, who still held the lease on the cellar. His disguise was simple but effective. Plain coat, worn gloves, a hood pulled low against the chill. In the dim corridors below Parliament, he moved like a shadow. Respectful, silent, unremarkable. The guards greeted him with lazy nods. He returned them with the faint smile of a man who had nothing to hide. By early October, the cellar was complete. The floor was lined with barrels, stacked 3 deep and covered with layers of iron tools, stones, and coal to disguise their true purpose. Fawkes checked each one meticulously. He ran his hands over the lids, feeling for cracks, ensuring no moisture had spoiled the powder. The smell of sulfur hung faintly in the air, masked by the heavier scent of damp earth. He noted every fuse, every match, every contingency. Above ground, the Palace of Westminster bustled with routine. Clerks sorted documents, couriers came and went. Carpenters repaired benches in anticipation of the king's visit. The normal rhythm of government continued, unaware that beneath its foundations, destiny waited with a slow-burning fuse. Catesby spent these final days at his manor in the Midlands, balancing faith with fear. He read from the Book of Maccabees, stories of resistance, of men who rose against tyranny in the name of God. His candlelight flickered across the pages, illuminating words that seemed written for him alone. It is better to die in battle than to see the ruin of our people. Yet even as he read, doubt moved like a ghost behind his thoughts. Would heaven truly bless this fire, or would it consume them all? Thomas Winter tried to steady him, but his own voice carried unease. If God favors our cause, he will show us, he said. But if we act without his will... Catesby interrupted softly. Then he will judge us as men who tried. Far away in the stone corridors beneath Parliament, Guy Fawkes prepared for what must be done. His routine became a kind of prayer. He rose before dawn, inspected the barrels, checked the locks on the door, and then sat in silence for hours, listening to the drip of water from the ceiling. Above him, footsteps echoed faintly, the murmurs of clerks and servants going about their days, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been chosen as an altar. At night, the rain came. It pattered against the river, soft and rhythmic, masking the movements of those who passed through the streets. Sometimes Fawkes would step outside to breathe the cold air. The Thames glistened under the moonlight, and he could see the faint reflection of St. Paul's Dome far in the distance. London seemed asleep, yet he knew how quickly sleep could become silence. Elsewhere, James I signed orders for the ceremonial opening of Parliament. He wrote in his firm, deliberate hand, unaware that the date he inscribed, November 5th, would soon belong not to ceremony, but to history. If one were to see these moments unfold from above, they would appear as parallel lines converging. The king with his pen, the conspirator with his fuse, the priest with his prayers. Each believed they served a higher cause, yet none could see the fire building between them. Catesby gathered the men one last time before the appointed day. They met in the upper room of a tavern near the Strand. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and ale, and their voices were hushed, even in secrecy. Fawkes, quiet as always, sat apart, his expression calm but resolute. "This is our moment," Catesby said, his tone measured. "When the king and his lords assemble, we strike. England will awaken from her chains, and the world will know that faith cannot be buried beneath stone." Thomas Percy raised his glass but did not drink. "And if it fails?" he asked. Catesby looked at him with something between pity and conviction. "Then we die as witnesses that it could not." The room fell silent. Somewhere outside, a church bell struck 10. Each man turned inward, measuring his courage against the hour. When they parted that night, there were no grand farewells, only nods, brief clasped hands, the quiet understanding that history does not always remember its authors. Fawkes returned to Westminster, carrying with him the last of the fuses and a letter sealed in wax, a prayer written in his own hand. He placed it inside his coat, close to his heart. In the following days, the world above continued its routine, indifferent to the storm below. Ministers discussed trade, children played in the courtyards, merchants opened their stalls. Yet the closer the date approached, the heavier the air became. Londoners spoke of strange omens, dogs barking at shadows, church candles flickering without wind. Perhaps it was only the season, or perhaps, as one chronicler would later write, the city itself sensed the fire that walked beneath its feet. Down in the cellar, Fawkes prepared for the final act. He checked the barrels one last time, securing each with iron hoops. He arranged kindling and straw to help the flame catch, then placed slow-burning matches beside the pile, enough to give him time to escape across the river before the blast. Everything was ready, and yet, as he stood alone in that cavernous silence, the enormity of it pressed upon him. The air was heavy, dense, alive with the scent of earth and saltpeter. He ran his hand over the rough stone wall, feeling the pulse of history through the cold. He thought of England, not the kingdom of lords and laws, but the quiet fields of his childhood, the bells of York on a Sunday morning. Was this truly the way to save it? Above him, the rain began again, drumming softly on the roof of Parliament. In another part of the city, King James dined with his court, discussing theology and peace. He spoke of unity, of reason, of divine order. The irony, perhaps, was that his words were true, and yet too late to reach those who had lost faith in words. Catesby, meanwhile, rode through the Midlands under a low sky. He carried letters for sympathizers who would rise after the explosion. His horse's hooves struck sparks on the wet road, each sound fading quickly into the wind. Behind him, the clouds thickened as though the heavens themselves were holding back their breath. That night, 3 worlds turned as one. In one, the king sealed his plans for order. In another, a soldier tested the fuse of chaos. In the last, a believer read scripture and prayed for forgiveness. History, like lightning, draws its power from such collisions. It is said that every revolution begins not with fire, but with faith. Faith that a single spark can burn through the weight of an empire. The men who plotted beneath Westminster believed they were lighting a torch for freedom. They could not see that their torch was also a mirror, reflecting the same darkness they sought to destroy. Above ground, Londoners slept in ignorance, their dreams untouched by the tremors below. Below ground, Guy Fawkes waited, surrounded by barrels of potential history. Between them lay only time. A few nights, a few breaths, before one world would fall into the other. The cellar smelled of iron and earth. The air was damp and still. Fawkes knelt beside the barrels, hands clasped, whispering a prayer that would never be written. He prayed not for victory nor for survival, but for meaning, that the act itself would awaken something purer than the hatred it concealed. Outside, the sound of hooves echoed on the cobblestones. The rain had stopped. Somewhere across the river, the clock struck midnight. In that moment, all of London seemed to pause, caught between faith and fear, between the old world and the one waiting to be born. And as Guy Fawkes rose to his feet, his shadow stretching long across the damp stone, history itself seemed to lean closer, listening for the sound of the match that had not yet been lit. For in every age there comes a moment when men believe that a single spark can burn through the order of the world, that destruction can somehow deliver renewal, and in that moment they mistake the fire for light. Such was the cellar beneath Westminster, a chamber not merely of conspiracy, but of conviction, a place where silence held its breath, waiting for destiny to strike. And though no flame had yet been lit, the story of England was already smoldering. The night had turned colder by the end of October, the fog sinking low over London, like a veil drawn to hide what was coming. Fires burned dimly behind shuttered windows. The city felt uneasy, though few could say why. The air itself seemed to hum with secrecy. Somewhere beyond the Thames, in a modest house belonging to a nobleman named William Parker, better known as Lord Monteagle, a servant approached with a sealed letter delivered by an unknown messenger. It was a quiet evening. Monteagle sat at supper with friends, the faint crackle of the hearth softening the chill. When the letter arrived, he hesitated. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the seal unmarked. Curiosity outweighed caution. He broke the wax, unfolded the parchment, and began to read aloud, his voice at first steady, then faltering. "My lord, out of the love I bear for some of your friends, I would advise you, as you value your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament, for they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." He stopped reading. The words hung in the air like smoke. Around him the room fell silent except for the hiss of the fire. The letter continued with vague warnings. "Retire yourself into the country where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a sudden blow." Monteagle lowered the paper, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. "A terrible blow," he murmured. The phrasing was odd, both cautious and knowing, as if the writer feared too much clarity. For a long moment he said nothing, weighing the meaning against the pulse in his throat. Was it a jest, a trap, or a genuine warning? Monteagle was no stranger to danger. As a nobleman with Catholic sympathies, he had walked the fine line between loyalty and suspicion for years. He knew too well the language of fear, the half-whispered threats that could mean ruin. And yet this letter carried something different, a tone not of malice but of urgency. Whoever wrote it wanted him alive. He folded the parchment carefully, eyes narrowing. Then, with deliberate calm, he rose from the table. "This must go to Cecil," he said. "At once." Robert Cecil, the king's most trusted minister, received the letter later that evening. He was at Whitehall, surrounded by papers, maps, and the constant hum of power. The candlelight caught the angles of his face, sharp, fox-like, perpetually calculating. When Monteagle's messenger placed the folded parchment before him, Cecil paused mid-sentence, studying it as though it were a puzzle he had been expecting. He read it once silently, then again aloud to his aides. His brow furrowed, not in surprise but in concentration. "A blow. They shall not see who hurts them," he repeated softly. The words lingered on his tongue. There was something almost poetic in their ambiguity, too deliberate to be madness, too cautious to be harmless. Cecil had spent a lifetime reading between the lines of human ambition. He saw patterns where others saw coincidence, and opportunity where others saw danger. To him, the letter was not just a warning, it was a door. Behind it lay the shape of a plot, and perhaps the means to strengthen his own grasp on the king and court. He summoned a meeting. Within the hour, the Privy Council gathered in a dimly lit chamber of Whitehall Palace. The walls flickered with candlelight, long shadows stretching over a map of London pinned to the table. Pins marked the locations of known reticent houses, secret chapels, and taverns frequented by suspect Catholics. "The letter is vague," one counselor said. "It could mean anything, a hoax to distract us." "Or it could mean everything," Cecil replied. His tone was measured, but his eyes gleamed. "There are whispers already of discontent. Jesuits, Spanish agents, conspirators. This is not a jest." The king was informed the next morning. James listened as Cecil read the letter aloud in his careful, deliberate voice. The king's expression shifted from curiosity to unease. "A blow," he said, tapping the table with his finger. "They shall not see who hurts them." That sounds not like sword or poison. He paused, thinking aloud. "A blow. It sounds like powder. It was one of those rare moments when fear aligned perfectly with foresight. The council murmured in agreement, though no one dared to claim certainty. Cecil bowed slightly. Your Majesty's wisdom may well have saved us already. Still, we must confirm it. If there is fire beneath Westminster, we shall find it. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded in silence. Guards were dispatched to search cellars near Parliament under pretense of checking for repairs. Nothing was found at first. The conspirators, unaware that suspicion had begun to stir, continued their preparations. Guy Fawkes remained in the cellar, watchful as ever, the key to the powder hanging beneath his cloak. On the surface, everything seemed unchanged. Catesby was still in the countryside, Wintour still writing coded letters, Percy still smiling at court. But somewhere between Whitehall and Westminster, fate had already shifted. Cecil, meanwhile, moved like a spider tugging at threads. He leaked fragments of the letter's contents to select allies, ensuring that fear began to spread through the upper ranks of government. Yet he restrained from acting too soon. The longer the plot remained hidden, the greater the revelation, and the more irrefutable his power would become when it was discovered. Some later historians would whisper that Cecil knew more than he admitted, that he had allowed the plan to ripen just long enough to expose not only the plotters, but also the fragility of the Catholic cause. In his hands, the plot became not just a threat, but a gift. A failed rebellion could justify harsher laws, deeper control, and absolute loyalty to the crown. As one observer wrote years later, sometimes the shadow that guards the throne is darker than the one that seeks to overthrow it. Back at Whitehall, the council met again. The candles burned lower now, dripping wax onto the table like hours running out. Monocle sat near the back, silent, still haunted by the letter that had found him. Some said he had been part of the plot and betrayed it to save himself. Others said he had been chosen precisely because his loyalty was ambiguous, that the letter had been sent to him by one of the conspirators as a desperate attempt to prevent catastrophe. No one knew. Perhaps no one ever would. Cecil unfolded the parchment once more. The ink had faded slightly at the edges where the flame had brushed it. He tapped it with one finger. "This," he said, "is the instrument by which we shall prove our vigilance." He ordered another search, more thorough, more secretive. Men were sent to inspect every vault, every cellar beneath Parliament. "Do not disturb the tenants," Cecil instructed. "We must not startle the fox before we see its den." The king nodded approvingly, though unease clouded his eyes. "See to it," he said, "and let the light find whatever hides beneath our feet." Outside, rain lashed against the palace windows. The Thames rolled dark and heavy, carrying the reflections of the city's towers. Within those reflections, destiny shimmered, fragile, waiting to be touched. In the days that followed, rumor outpaced truth. Some said the Jesuits had been seen meeting by candlelight. Others whispered that Spain had sent gold to finance treason. London's taverns hummed with speculation. Yet through it all, Robert Cecil remained silent. He preferred the weight of suspicion to the finality of proof. The longer the fear lingered, the stronger his influence grew. He was a man who understood that power does not come from certainty, but from control of uncertainty. And in that fog of doubt, he became indispensable to his king. One night, as he sat alone in his study, the letter spread before him. Cecil leaned back and closed his eyes. The candlelight trembled against his features. In another man, it might have been fatigue. In him, it looked like satisfaction. He whispered to the empty room, "A kingdom strengthened by fear is still a kingdom." Then, almost as if to himself, he added, "And fear, once kindled, never goes out." Outside, the bells of London tolled midnight. Somewhere across the city, a soldier named John Johnson tended the powder beneath Westminster. He did not yet know that the light of his match would never reach the barrels, that another kind of fire, invisible but no less deadly, was already burning in Whitehall. In the end, history would remember the Gunpowder plot as an act of faith gone astray. But in truth, it also became an act of politics fulfilled. The warning to Monteagle, the letter to Cecil, the king's intuition, all converged into a single moment when fear reshaped power. For what is a throne, after all, but a structure built upon vigilance and the promise of danger? Every monarch learns that fear can serve as both shield and weapon, And in that autumn of 1605, as London slept beneath its fog, both fires, the one underground and the one within men's hearts, burn toward the same inevitable dawn. In every age there comes a moment when power and fear exchange places, when rulers no longer fear rebellion, but begin to depend on it. And perhaps that was the quiet genius of Robert Cecil. He did not merely save a king from destruction, he taught him how to rule by the echo of a danger that would never truly die. The night of November 4th, 1605, descended over London with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The city, wrapped in fog, slept uneasily beneath a cold moon. Along the Thames, the water whispered against the stone embankments, carrying the echo of hooves and the creak of wooden wheels. Parliament stood silent, its great halls dark, its windows dim. Only beneath it, in the cellar that had become the heart of an unspoken dream, a single figure remained awake. Guy Fawkes. John Johnson, to those who might ask, stood by the barrels of powder, his lantern turned low. The flickering light brushed his face, catching in the steel of his gaze. He had waited years for this night, endured secrecy, danger, and prayer. Now, at the edge of fate, he was calm. The air around him smelled of earth, smoke, and iron, the scent of both devotion and doom. He checked the fuses one last time, his movements deliberate and quiet. Each knot tied was a vow. Each spark prepared was a line of faith, written in flame. Above, the bells of London struck 11. Within a few hours, the king and his council would gather above his head. And then the old order would burn away, and something new might rise from its ashes. Yet in another corner of the city, destiny had already begun to turn. At Whitehall, Robert Cecil stood beside the king, reading reports from the last round of inspections. The earlier searches had found nothing, but the king, restless, sharp-eyed, had insisted on one more. The warning spoke of a blow, James said quietly. And a blow, if it is to strike unseen, must come from beneath. Cecil bowed. As your majesty commands. He sent Sir Thomas Knivet, a trusted officer of the crown, to Westminster just before midnight, with orders to search every vault, every shadow. Knivet was a cautious man, but even he felt a chill as he and his men approached the dark entrance to the Parliament cellars. Their torches hissed in the damp air, the smoke curling into the low ceiling like ghostly fingers. A single watchman waited by the gate, a man with a calm voice and unshaken composure. "Who goes there?" he called out, his hand resting on his belt. Knivet stepped forward. "King's men," he answered. "We are to search these premises." The watchman nodded, his expression unreadable. "As you will. I am John Johnson, servant to Master Percy." "Then you'll stand aside, Master Johnson," Knivet replied, his tone polite but firm. Fawkes did as commanded, his lantern casting long shadows on the brick floor. The guards moved in, their boots echoing softly. They pried open crates and shifted piles of coal until one of them struck wood that rang hollow. "Sir," the soldier said, voice tight, "there's something here." They lifted the boards, revealing the outline of barrels stacked deep beneath the kindling. The sharp scent of powder drifted upward like a confession. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Knavet turned sharply. "Seize him!" Fawkes stepped back, his face lit by the trembling torchlight. "There's no need," he said calmly. "You've found what you came for." They bound his hands, though he did not resist. As they led him up the narrow stairway, Knivet asked, "Your name, again?" "John Johnson," he replied evenly. "And your soul, sir, to whom does it belong?" Fawkes met his gaze, unflinching. "To God, and to England, truly so." Outside, the first hint of dawn brushed the Thames with silver. As the soldiers marched their prisoner through the fog, the great bell of St. Paul's began to toll. Each sound rolled across the river like the heartbeat of a waking empire. The city did not yet know what had been prevented, nor how close it had come to disaster. By morning, the news spread like wildfire. A cellar beneath Parliament had been discovered, filled with barrels of gunpowder, enough to shatter the city. The man caught there refused to speak his true name. Rumors ran faster than truth, that he was Spanish, that he was a priest, that he was sent by the devil himself. But when Robert Cecil looked into his eyes, he saw something else entirely. Conviction. King James demanded to see him. The meeting took place in a small chamber within Whitehall. The king entered with his usual composure, though beneath it there was curiosity, even admiration. Guy Fawkes stood before him, weary but unbowed, his wrists chained, his expression still defiant. "So," the king began, "you are the man who would have destroyed us all." Fawkes inclined his head slightly. "If you call it destruction, then yes, but I would call it renewal." James studied him carefully. "Do you understand what your act would have done?" "I do, your majesty," Fawkes replied, "and if I had succeeded, you would have perished in the light of glory, not in the shadow of deceit." The king blinked. It was not the answer he expected. Cecil watched from the corner, silent, calculating. To him, this man was not a monster, but a tool, a living embodiment of treason that could justify every chain the crown might forge thereafter. James leaned forward. "Tell me, do you repent?" Fawkes smiled faintly. "Repent, only that I failed." The silence that followed was as cold as the stone walls around them. He was taken to the Tower of London that afternoon. The fortress loomed over the river like a memory of darker centuries, its white walls reflecting the pale November sun. Inside, the corridors smelled of ink and iron. Guards escorted him to a small cell beneath the ramparts, a place where even echoes seemed afraid to linger. It was here, under flickering light, that the slow unraveling began. The king had ordered a confession, and Cecil was determined to obtain it. Yet there was no fury in the process, no cruelty for its own sake, only the steady, methodical pressure of power. They asked questions. He gave none of the answers they sought. They pressed again. Still silence. His resolve, though strained, did not crack easily. To his captors he was frustrating, to his enemies almost admirable. Over time, the isolation did what no blade could. Fawkes's eyes grew heavy, his voice faint. When he finally spoke, it was not fear that broke him, but exhaustion, the quiet surrender of a man who had already made peace with his conscience. On the writing desk nearby, a quill scratched softly across parchment. Each word it wrote felt like the extinguishing of a spark. Guy Fawkes. Confession. The ink bled slightly at the edges, as though the truth itself resisted being confined to paper. Outside, life went on. Londoners filled the streets again, relieved but uneasy. Church bells rang in thanksgiving. Bonfires were lit in celebration of deliverance, though few truly understood what they were rejoicing for. King James declared a day of remembrance, not for Guy Fawkes, but for his failure. The people cheered his wisdom, not realizing that in their joy they had been bound a little tighter to the crown. For Robert Cecil, the plot's discovery was a triumph. He stood at the window of Whitehall, watching the fires glow across the river, and whispered, "Order restored by the promise of chaos." In Parliament, members praised divine providence. Sermons thundered about faith and loyalty. The word traitor became sacred again, a convenient boundary between the righteous and the damned. And beneath the chorus of celebration, one question lingered, unspoken. Was the man they condemned truly evil, or simply too faithful to the wrong hope? History, ever the patient observer, would answer softly. Guy Fawkes was not a villain. He was a believer. He had fought for Spain, prayed for England, and dreamed of a world where conscience ruled above kings. His sin was not hatred, but devotion. Devotion carried too far, sharpened into desperation. And yet, in that desperation, he became a mirror for his age. In him, one could see the shadow of all those who would die for ideas they could not question. The face of conviction turned blind. His defiance became both warning and legend. Centuries later, the echo of his name would outlast his defeat. Children would light fires on cold November nights, unaware that they were celebrating not his failure, but his persistence, the enduring fire of belief that refuses to die, even when buried in darkness. As dawn broke on November 6th, Guy Fawkes sat in his cell, the faint light of morning creeping across the floor. His hands trembled slightly as he looked toward the barred window. The sound of the Thames drifted faintly through the air. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, not in fear, but in reflection. Perhaps, he thought, There was still a kind of victory in what had been lost. The powder had not ignited, but the idea had. The idea that faith, for better or worse, still held the power to shake empires. Above the tower, the city stirred awake. The fog began to lift. Bells rang for a king whose rule was now unquestioned, and for a prisoner whose silence had become immortal. In that strange balance between light and shadow, power and faith, England entered a new dawn. A dawn not of peace but of understanding, that even the hand which holds the torch must fear the flame it carries. For in the end Guy Fawkes was neither hero nor villain. He was the face of belief caught between salvation and ruin. The sort man who almost set the world alight, and in doing so, ensured that its memory would never go dark. The dawn after Guy Fawkes's capture broke pale and silent over England. Mist clung to the fields like the breath of something wounded. The bells of London still rang in triumph, but far from the capital, in the damp heart of the Midlands, another sound echoed, the frantic thunder of hooves cutting through rain and mud. Robert Catesby rode at the head of a dwindling band of men, his cloak heavy with water, his heart heavier still. Behind him rode Thomas Percy, the Wright brothers, and a few others who had once believed themselves chosen by destiny. Now their world had collapsed overnight. The plan they had crafted in whispers and prayer had become a curse on their names. The hounds of the crown were already loosed, and every church bell that rang deliverance in London was a death knell for them. The road through the Midlands was slick and treacherous. Wind tore at their faces. Their horses stumbled in the mire. They stopped only to pray and to reload their weapons, though none of them expected to use them again. Catesby's face, once fierce with conviction, was now shadowed by something quieter, not fear, but comprehension. He understood now that faith, when carried too far, becomes indistinguishable from folly. Yet, even in ruin, he felt no hatred, only sorrow. "We have failed," Thomas Winter murmured beside him, his voice barely audible through the rain. Catesby turned slightly, his eyes unwavering. "Not failed," he said. "Revealed." Winter frowned. "Revealed what?" "That men cannot serve both conscience and king, and keep their souls whole." The words fell between them like embers dying in the rain. By the time they reached Holbesha House, the rain had turned to sleet. The small manor stood on a rise, gray and crumbling. Its windows shuddered against the wind. It was here that they made their final stand, not as rebels hoping to triumph, but as men seeking to rest. They dismounted in silence, the horses trembling with exhaustion. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and damp timber. One of the Wright brothers lit a fire in the hearth, while Percy dragged in a barrel of gunpowder they had salvaged from their flight. It was wet, useless now, but they kept it close, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because it reminded them of what they had once been willing to die for. Catesby moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The horizon was dim and colorless, the landscape shrouded in fog. "They will come by morning," he said softly. "The king's men. Cecile will want us alive, but he will settle for proof we are dead." Winter, seated at the table, took a long breath. If God meant to save us, he would have done so already. Catesby turned, his voice steady. "No, God saves in ways men do not understand. Perhaps this—" He gestured to the flickering fire, to the cold walls, or to their broken faces. "Perhaps this is salvation." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of distant horns. The pursuers were closing in. By evening, they were surrounded. Through the mist, the riders of the king's militia appeared, dark figures against the pale countryside. The flash of steel glinted between the trees. Inside the house, the men loaded their pistols and checked the damp barrels of their muskets. The powder would not ignite easily, but no one spoke of surrender. They had no illusions left, only dignity. Catesby stood by the window, holding a crucifix in one hand and his sword in the other. He looked at the faces of his companions, tired, soaked, hollow-eyed, and saw in them the reflection of his own faith, stubborn, flawed, but unbroken. "We are not dying for treason," he said quietly. "We are dying for the right to believe." Percy nodded, his jaw set. "Then let them see how men of faith die." A shot rang out from the fog outside, splintering the wooden frame of the window. The siege had begun. Smoke filled the narrow hallways. The sharp smell of spent powder mingled with the scent of rain and timber. The air trembled with sound, gunfire, shouts, the pounding of boots. Inside Holbecca House, time seemed to slow. Fawkes had already fallen into the pages of legend. Now his comrades were writing the last line of that same story. Thomas Wintour stumbled toward the hearth, clutching the soaked gunpowder they had brought. "It's no use," he gasped. "It's ruined." "Dry it," Catesby said. "Even a spark can still bear witness." They spread the damp powder near the fire, hoping to salvage some of it. But the moment the embers touched, the moisture hissed, and then, without warning, a burst of light filled the room. A flash, bright, white, almost holy, tore through the air. The blast was brief, but it lit the house like dawn breaking through the end of the world. When the smoke began to clear, silence followed, a silence so deep it seemed the house itself was holding its breath. Catesby staggered to his knees. The crucifix he had been holding now lay a few feet away, blackened by soot. Around him the survivors moved weakly, coughing, dazed. The air shimmered with the dust of burned timber. He crawled toward the wall, where a small wooden cross hung above the mantel. The light from the fire painted it gold. For a moment he simply stared, the man who had once dreamed of purifying England through flame, now kneeling before a different fire, one of acceptance. Thomas Percy dragged himself closer, blood on his sleeve, eyes wide with disbelief. "It's over," he said, the words breaking. Catesby turned to him, a faint, weary smile on his face. "No," he whispered. "It's begun." Percy frowned. "What begun?" Catesby looked up at the crucifix, voice soft but clear. "Understanding. They will call us traitors. They will curse our names. But perhaps, someday, they will understand." He bowed his head. "We failed," he said quietly, "but God will understand." Outside, the king's soldiers approached cautiously. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick with the echo of it. Through the shattered windows, the first gray light of morning spilled into the house, catching in the lingering smoke. One soldier, peering inside, hesitated. The scene before him was not of villains defeated, but of men undone by their own conviction. The air smelled not of battle, but of something almost sacred, like incense after prayer. From afar, Holbecca House looked like a ruin swallowed by mist. The chimney still smoked faintly, the last ember of a rebellion that never became a revolution. Within hours, word reached London. Cecil's agents reported that the leaders of the Gunpowder plot were dead. The crown had triumphed. Order was restored. At Whitehall, Robert Cecil read the message without emotion. He folded the parchment, set it aside, and looked out of the window toward the gray river. "The fire is quenched," he said quietly, "but its light will last longer than we wish." King James nodded, weary yet satisfied. "Then let England remember this lesson, that rebellion born of faith burns both the heretic and the believer alike." And so it was written into the chronicles of the realm. The gunpowder treason discovered. But history, with its endless patience, would remember more than the official words. It would remember the cold rain on Catesby's face, the trembling hands of men who prayed even as they were condemned, and the way the smoke at Holbecca House rose upward like a fading prayer, twisting, curling, until it formed, for a moment, the shape of an upside-down crown, a crown undone. In the end, the rebellion did not die in Westminster, nor even in the fires of Holbecca. It lived on, in whispers and caution, in the uneasy peace that followed. The Gunpowder plot became not only a story of treachery, but of belief taken too far, a reminder that devotion, when bound to desperation, can ignite a nation and consume it at the same time. As the soldiers departed and the house fell silent, the rain began again, soft and steady. It washed the soot from the stones, carrying away the last trace of defiance. But for those who had seen it, who had felt the heat of that final blaze, the memory lingered. The memory of a man who knelt beneath a burning cross, whispering to the silence, "We failed, but God will understand." And as the smoke curled into the cold November sky, it took with it the last illusion of victory, leaving behind only the truth that all faith, when turned to fire, must face the light it creates. The winter of 1606 came heavy and gray, settling over London like a shroud. The fires that had burned in celebration months before had long faded, but their smoke lingered in memory. the smoke of fear, of victory, and of silence. The gunpowder plot was over, yet its echoes filled the air like a sermon no one dared to question. In January, Westminster Hall prepared for its greatest performance of judgment. The ancient hall, vast, vaulted, and solemn, had seen kings crowned and traitors condemned, but seldom had it held so much expectation. Banners of the crown hung heavy against the stone walls. Guards lined the aisles with halberds gleaming in the dull light. The public was admitted, whispering among themselves like parishioners at a grim mass. And then, through the murmuring crowd, the prisoners were led in. They came chained, weary, and pale. Thomas Wintour, stoic. Ambrose Rookwood, trembling, but proud. Digby, hollow-eyed with guilt. And, at the end, Guy Fawkes, limping, his body thin, his beard unkempt, yet his face astonishingly calm. The months in the Tower had stripped him of strength, but not of composure. When his name was called, he lifted his head and smiled faintly, as if to acknowledge a truth that needed no defense. The judges entered, robed in crimson. Trumpets sounded once, sharp and brief, cutting through the murmurs. Silence fell. The indictment was read, a long, winding recitation of treason, conspiracy, and the wicked intent to destroy His Majesty, his noble peers, and the whole realm of England. The words echoed against the ancient stones, heavy with righteousness. When asked for his plea, Fawkes's voice, though weak, carried clearly. Guilty, though only to the purpose, not the sin. A stir rippled through the hall. One of the judges frowned. "You mean to confess yet justify your cause?" Fawkes met his gaze. "I mean only to speak as my conscience allows. I sought not to harm men, but to awaken them." The prosecutor's tone hardened. "And by fire?" "By light," Fawkes replied simply. It was not defiance, nor arrogance, only conviction, steady and resigned. The proceedings continued, relentless and theatrical. Witnesses described barrels, letters, oaths. Officials recited the king's miraculous deliverance. The crowd murmured praise at every mention of Providence, but even among them a few faces seemed uncertain, uneasy with how easily faith had turned into fear. At last, the sentence was read aloud, that you be taken to the place from whence you came, drawn upon a hurdle through the streets to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck, then severed and divided, that others may learn by your example what becomes of traitors. The words were ancient, ritualistic, a performance of power disguised as justice. Fawkes stood silent through it all. When the judge finished, he bowed his head slightly. "May God judge more kindly than men," he murmured. The clerk recorded his words without looking up. The gavel struck once. The echo rolled through Westminster Hall like thunder trapped in stone, and so it was done. Outside, the wind swept along the river, carrying the sound of bells from St. Paul's. The day of execution came cold and pale. January 31st. The sky hung low, colorless, and the streets were lined with spectators long before dawn. Guy Fawkes was the last to be brought forth. He leaned heavily on the shoulders of guards, his body weakened from months of confinement. Yet when the crowd saw him, a strange hush fell. He was thinner, yes, but not broken. There was still something in the set of his jaw, an echo of the man who had once kept vigil beneath Parliament, waiting for divine fire. As he was led toward the scaffold, someone shouted from the crowd, "Do you regret it now, Fawkes?" He turned his head slightly. "Only that it failed," he said. The murmurs spread, half outrage, half awe. Even in defeat, he refused to curse his purpose. The platform stood tall against the sky, draped in black. The officials read the sentence once more, their voices echoing flatly through the winter air. Then, as custom demanded, Fawkes was asked for his final words. He looked upward, not at the rope, but beyond it. "I die as a man who sought truth, though found only its shadow," he said quietly. "May England someday learn to burn for justice without burning her sons for faith." The executioner stepped forward. Fawkes straightened himself, gripping the ladder for balance. He hesitated only once, not in fear, but in resolve. And before the man beside him could move, Guy Fawkes did what he had planned all along. He leapt. The crowd gasped. A sudden stillness filled the air. a silence so complete it seemed to erase the world for a moment. Then, as the morning sun broke weakly through the fog, a single church bell began to toll. It was not triumph that echoed through the city that day, but a kind of uneasy reverence, as if even those who condemned him could not help but sense the strange dignity in his end. That evening, the king dined at Whitehall. His ministers congratulated him on the safety of the realm, the loyalty of the people, the providence of God. Yet for a moment, James said nothing. He merely looked toward the window, where the last rays of sunset glowed red over the Thames. He was a brave man, the king said softly. Misguided, but brave. Cecil inclined his head. Courage in error is still error, sire. James nodded. Perhaps, yet I cannot help but wonder which is the greater sin, to kill for faith, or to silence it. No one replied. The candles flickered. Outside, the city settled into darkness, its chimneys still trailing smoke from the day's spectacle. History would carry his name further than any king or minister of his age. For generations, the 5th of November would be marked with bonfires and fireworks. Guy Fawkes Night, they would call it. A festival of deliverance, a warning dressed as celebration. Children would chant, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November," their voices bright and careless, not knowing that behind those words lay centuries of fear and faith intertwined. Yet beneath the noise, beneath the laughter and the firelight, something quieter endured. The image of a man who had dared to act on belief, however misguided. Guy Fawkes was no saint, nor devil. He was a man who lived and died within the paradox of his time, that in an age of reason and faith, neither could exist without the shadow of the other. His story became a mirror, reflecting not just rebellion, but the eternal question that follows power wherever it reigns. When is defiance a sin, and when is it a duty? And so, though the crown prevailed, though order was restored, and the church stood unshaken, the echo of that question lived on. In whispers, in embers, in the hearts of those who still believed that truth could not be buried forever. Centuries later, his name would resurface again and again, not as a curse, but as a symbol. To some, a warning. To others, a spark. For history, in its strange mercy, often redeems what it once condemned. And so the man who sought to destroy a kingdom became instead a reminder of what happens when kingdoms forget the hearts of their people. In the end, Guy Fawkes did not light the fuse beneath Parliament, but he lit something else, an idea, fragile yet enduring. That conviction, though dangerous, is the flame by which humanity defines itself. He was remembered as a rebel, yes, but also as the man who dared to bring light where others saw only darkness. And though centuries would pass, and his mask would become a symbol for new rebellions, one truth would remain the same: that faith, once kindled, never truly dies. It merely waits for the next hand to carry the flame. 4 centuries after the gunpowder was swept away from the cellars beneath Westminster, the fire it represented still burns, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. Every year, as autumn dies and November breathes its chill across England, the night of the 5th of November arrives once more. The world turns dark early, and the air fills with the scent of smoke and cider. Across towns and villages, fields and riversides, people gather around the firelight. Bonfire night. Children wave sparklers that carve fleeting stars into the dusk. Fireworks blossom over rooftops, bursts of crimson, gold, and silver that paint the black sky with noise and wonder. Parents smile, lovers hold hands, and the crowd counts down before the biggest rocket shoots upward and blooms into light. Somewhere in every blaze, a straw effigy, the Guy, burns. His face, sometimes crude and cartoonish, is lifted by the flames until it crumbles into ash. Few of those gathered remember precisely who he was or why he burned. Yet the ritual endures, transformed from curse to custom. The act that once condemned a man to infamy now keeps his memory alive, not as villain or saint, but as a flicker of defiance in the long history of obedience. It began as a decree of celebration. In 1606, Parliament declared the 5th of November a day of thanksgiving for the joyful deliverance of the king and the realm. Bells rang, sermons preached, bonfires blazed, not for Fawkes, but against him. The people rejoiced, believing they had been spared from ruin. Over time, though, something shifted. The night became less about loyalty and more about spectacle. By the 18th century, children paraded through streets carrying stuffed figures, shouting, "Penny for the guy!" They begged coins to buy fireworks, laughing without fear. The story had softened. Treason had turned to tradition. The bonfire no longer burned in warning, but in celebration of the light itself. And so, the flame that was meant to destroy became the one that gathered people together. Yet the political shadow of that fire never truly faded. In the years that followed the plot, England tightened its grip on the Catholic minority. New laws were passed. Recusants were fined, imprisoned, and excluded from public life. The memory of Guy Fawkes became an excuse for surveillance, suspicion, and division. For decades, being Catholic in England meant living behind closed doors, praying quietly, trusting few. The government that had once feared destruction now wielded that fear as power. Each 5th of November, loyal citizens were urged to remember the treason and give thanks for the preservation of the crown. It was not merely a festival, it was a lesson retold every year in fire and noise. Loyalty through fear, unity through obedience. But history has a way of changing its tone when the years grow long. The same story that was once used to justify control began to inspire the opposite. A slow awakening to the idea that even kings could be challenged. Writers, philosophers, and rebels alike began to see in the Gunpowder plot not just a warning of treason, but a symbol of resistance. They did not honor the act itself, which was violent and misguided, but the sentiment beneath it. That absolute power, left unchecked, will always breed desperation. The very government that had sought to suppress rebellion had unwittingly given birth to one of history's most enduring questions. When is disobedience justified? Over time, that question shaped nations. The American colonies, centuries later, would echo it in their own struggle against monarchy. The thinkers of the Enlightenment would write of liberty, conscience, and the moral duty to resist tyranny. And deep in England's collective memory, the figure of Guy Fawkes, the failed conspirator, became an uneasy ancestor to the modern idea of protest. He was remembered not for the explosion that never came, but for the spark he left behind. In the modern age, the mask of Guy Fawkes would return, not as an effigy, but as an emblem. Its stylized grin, pale and calm, appeared again in protests, movements, and screens around the world. From London to Hong Kong, from the streets of Washington to the digital frontiers of the internet, his image became shorthand for those who dared to challenge authority. Of course, he did not imagine this legacy. He was no prophet of democracy, no champion of equality. He was a man of his time, devout, flawed, and desperate. But symbols are rarely chosen by those they represent. They are forged by those who need them. And in every age, humanity finds in him the same message, that power without justice will always fear the shadows it casts. The bonfires still burn, though few now carry the weight of history in their glow. The children laugh, the rockets burst, and the flames dance across faces that no longer know the story in full. Yet somewhere, in the quiet between explosions, the truth lingers that this celebration began as a warning and has endured as a reminder, because beneath the laughter, Bonfire Night holds a paradox. It honors the defeat of rebellion, but also the endurance of rebellion's spirit. Tonight, London stands once again beneath a sky alive with fire. The river reflects the bursts of light like a second heaven, each explosion fading into mist and memory. The old stones of Westminster, once nearly torn apart by the powder hidden below, now shimmer gold under the glow of celebration. Crowds gather along the banks of the Thames, faces lifted, eyes wide. The air smells of smoke and rain, the same scent that once haunted the conspirators in their flight. But there is no fear here, only awe, and something deeper, quieter, woven beneath the noise, remembrance. For all the centuries that separate this night from that fateful one, the same truth still flickers in the flames. Power may stand tall, and crowns may shine, but light belongs to no king. A child holds up a sparkler, a tiny trembling imitation of the fires that once promised ruin, and laughs as it burns bright in the dark. His parents watch, smiling, unaware that in his hand is the last echo of a question that has outlived empires. The fireworks fade, smoke drifts over the rooftops. For a brief, weightless moment, London is still. Then somewhere in the distance, the final rocket ascends, high, silent, before it bursts into a cascade of gold. In that instant, the city seems to remember, not the treason, not the punishment, but the fire, the simple, human fire that refuses to die. And as the last embers fade, a voice, distant, like the whisper of history itself, seems to linger above the rooftops, carried on the wind. 400 years have passed, and still they burn their fires, not to destroy, but to remind that power without justice will always fear the dark. The crowd disperses, the city exhales, the river flows on beneath its bridges, and in the fading smoke, the legacy of the Gunpowder Plot endures, not in anger or revolt, but in the eternal shimmer of remembrance, where every spark is both warning and promise, because history, like fire, never truly dies. It waits, quietly, for someone to strike the next match. As the smoke of bonfire night fades into the chill of an English November, what remains is not the roar of fireworks, but a silence, the kind of silence that history leaves behind when it has finished speaking. The story of the Gunpowder Plot began in darkness beneath the stone vaults of Westminster, where faith and desperation met like flint and steel. It ended not in the blaze its conspirators dreamed of, but in a quieter fire, one that would smolder for centuries, reshaping how England understood loyalty, conscience, and power. In the end, no explosion was needed to change the realm. The idea itself proved louder than any detonation. The plotters failed to destroy a king, but they succeeded unknowingly in exposing a deeper truth, that fear cannot govern forever, and that no crown, however sacred, can silence the human need to believe in something higher than itself. Through the centuries, kings rose and fell, faiths clashed and merged, and the empire stretched across oceans. Yet every November, the English still light their fires. Some do it for joy, some for tradition, some without knowing why. But the act remains, a conversation across time between the living and the dead, between power and principle. The flames that once condemned a man now illuminate his memory. The city that once trembled now celebrates under the same sky. And the question that haunted a nation, what is the price of faith, still lingers, unanswered but alive. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Gunpowder Plot, not rebellion nor martyrdom, but memory, the knowledge that belief, in all its fragile, dangerous beauty, can outlast even the might of a kingdom. As London settles into night, the last embers fade along the Thames. The reflections of the fireworks shimmer and vanish, leaving only the steady glow of the city, calm, enduring, eternal. Above it all, the old Parliament stands silent, a monument not to the power that survived, but to the courage that dared to question it. And somewhere in the wind, among the whispers of smoke, the voice of history seems to murmur one final line. They thought they could bury the fire, but the fire learned to live in the hearts of men. The screen fades to black. The echo of distant bells lingers. And the story of Guy Fawkes, born from flame, consumed by flame, remembered through flame, continues to burn quietly, endlessly in the long night of human history.